So thanks a lot for having me. I'm really excited to present today. So I'm talking, as you can see, on shamanism and the scope of psychedelic use. So my approach is that of an anthropologist. One of my major topics of study, and the reason I'm here, is I've worked on shamanism. I've mostly done fieldwork with the Mentawai people of Siberut Island in Indonesia. I've been working there since 2014, studying healing ceremonies, taboo, local deities. I've also just started more recently some work in the Orinoco region in northern Colombia on the border with Venezuela, studying indigenous psychedelic use, particularly yopo. And so that's just to give you a little bit of sense of where I'm coming from. I'm coming at this mostly as an anthropologist. And the thing that I'm going to structure my talk around is the stories that we often tell about psychedelics. And so here are just some examples, I think, that gesture at the stories that we tell about psychedelics and their use historically and around the world. So this is an article from the online publication Vox from 2019. They write, "Cultures around the world have been taking psychedelics for thousands of years, and each one developed rituals for them, led by experienced guides." This is another article from 2020. "Psychedelics have been used for millennia by indigenous peoples around the world, from the Amazon basin to Gabon to the American Great Plains." Here's from Michael Pollan's best-selling book, which we've seen referenced earlier today, "Elements of Shamanism might have a role to play in psychedelic therapy, as indeed it has probably done for several thousand years before there was such thing as science." Now, these claims, these quotes, I think, are all reflections of what I'm going to call today the global ancient psychedelic shamanism hypothesis. Sorry, it doesn't spell ops, it spells gaps. Still, it's like not a very graceful name of a hypothesis. It's just to give you a sense of what it is, and it's comprised of a couple common claims. So the first is that psychedelics were widespread historically. They were used around the world. The second is that not only were they used everywhere or in all of these widespread locales, but they have quite deep histories. And the third is that they have been used in these shamanic contexts for therapeutic healing. So I'm going to use this hypothesis to structure the talk today. I'm going to go through these different claims, and then at the end we're going to take a step back and look at shamanic traditions more generally and see what we can learn. So I'm going to start with these first two claims, that psychedelics were widespread and that they were ancient. So what is a psychedelic? That's, of course, the question that's guiding and overlaying this workshop, this conference. There are many uses. They can range from people thinking about psychotropic substances more generally to a much more constrained usage, which is quite common and which I'm seeing a lot over here, which is things like LSD, DMT, psilocybin, mescaline, and so on. So we can start by thinking about those first two claims about the scope of psychedelic use and the history with psychotropic substances more generally. This is, of course, like a less common use, so I'm not going to spend so much time over here. Now, one thing we're going to find a lot over the course of this talk is that there's always more research needed, but one project that has tried to examine psychotropic substances and their relationship to shamanism across societies is a database built by Michael Winkelmann. So Winkelmann examined descriptions of magical religious practitioners, priests, shamans, and so on in 45 societies, and he designed the sample to be a pseudo-random sample of human diversity. It's supposed to represent human cultural and geographic diversity, as I've just written here. And what he finds is that practitioners use psychotropic drugs, hallucinogens, opiates, stimulants, narcotics in 22 out of the 45 societies that he looks at, about half of them. A point that I want to make is that, so even when you look at this, it's easy for us to imagine what this looks like. Oh, patients or specialists are taking them. But there's still, even within these 22 societies, quite a bit of diverse use. And one example that I wanted to throw in right now is when drugs are only used to train practitioners. So these are trance specialists, but they are taking psychotropic substances purely to help develop their ability to enter these non-ordinary states. This is a very long quote, but it's by this healer Nisa from the Kung, and we'll actually later in the talk see some Kung healing. But this is a long quote that she told an anthropologist. There's a root that helps you to learn trance, which they dug for me. My mother put it in my little leather pouch and said, now you will start learning this. I started to tremble. People rubbed my body as I sat there, feeling the effect getting stronger and stronger. My body shook harder and I wanted to cry, or I started to cry. And among the Kung, among the Jutsuansi, the ethnic group that Nisa is a part of, trance is typically evoked through dancing, but again, during the initiations, they use these psychotropic substances. So that's just to give you a quick, broad perspective. I'm going to focus right now on these 5-HT2A agonists. So again, these are the serotonergic, the so-called classic psychedelics. These include things like psilocybin, DMT, LSD, mescaline, bufotenine, and so on. Again, there are these many claims of these being widespread, but there's little to no systematic work. A really important exception, people over here might be familiar with Martin Fortier, his Huthac database, hallucinogenic use throughout time and across cultures. So this was an incredibly ambitious project. He designed it to include more than 1,000 cultures. He built it by scouring academic books, historical chronicles, the diaries of explorers. And for every mention of psychedelics, or of hallucinogens actually more generally, he recorded which substances were used, who was using them, were they in hallucinogenic doses, how were they used, and then really critically, what kind of evidence is this? Is this ethnobotanical? Is this observational? Really tragically, Martin Fortier passed away in 2020, I believe. At the age of 30, he was still finishing his PhD, but he had published some of his preliminary findings online. And what he concluded, what he reported, is that in everything that he found and everything that he looked at, the evidence of hallucinogenic usage of these 5-HT2A agonists was limited to Mesoamerica and South America. So to the Rio Grande area, this is the range of peyote, the border between the United States and Mexico, what is now the border between the United States and Mexico, and southwards. Some of this usage is clearly ancient. So Anodonanthus snuffs, there's indications of long-term use. There's suggestions that peyote has been used for thousands of years. But he concluded that on the basis of this reliable evidence, he said a very liberal estimate is that 5% of cultures in the Americas were using these serotonergic psychedelics in hallucinogenic uses, which if then we step back and do some back of the envelope math, comes out to be about 1% of cultures that have been documented hallucinogenic use. Now, of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Because you do not see it in many places, that does not mean that it doesn't exist. One thing that he still nevertheless reiterated was that when psychedelics were used, he argued that it was very clear to anthropologists and explorers, and he concluded at least that it's unlikely that anthropologists were missing lots of psychedelic use. Now, regardless of whether you think this is reasonable logic, I think his research at least really demands a bit of skepticism towards these stories that might feel really nice and might be especially convenient as we try to push a broader acceptance of psychedelics and at least urge a bit more a more systematic approach and a bit more care in evaluating these claims. So Martin really prioritized observational evidence and ethnobotanical evidence. But of course, there's a lot of what appears to be literary and iconographic evidence. So many people point to myths, they point to art. But a limitation, of course, with myths and art is that they're and in the absence of a bit more systematicity, we should treat these with skepticism. Now, as an example, I'm going to focus on the claim that sacred mushrooms suffuse the world's mythologies. So in Gordon Wasson's famous Life article in 1957, where he talks about going to Mexico and taking what he calls magic mushrooms, where he coins the term magic mushrooms, he writes in this Life article, the supernatural power of mushrooms is still believed among many widely scattered peoples, the Arabs, the peoples of India, Persia, Tibetans, etc., etc. Was it not probable that long, long ago, before the beginnings of written history, our ancestors had worshipped a divine mushroom? This is a similar claim is still made in the literature today. So this is from a review by Winckelmann, and he says, the role of psilocybin mushrooms in the ancient evolution of human religions is attested to fungiform petroglyphs, rock artifacts, and mythologies from all major religions around the world. So I tried to do a very simple test of this claim, looking at what is called the Human Relations Area Files. The Human Relations Area Files is a database of anthropological reports. So when I had looked at it, when I did this little preliminary study, it included 50,000 paragraphs on the mythology of 321 cultures, covering 2,000 documents. This is like one of the best resources that exists for understanding humanity. They take observations and books and articles that anthropologists and explorers have published, and they put them into this incredible searchable database. So then I just searched all of these paragraphs for the word mushroom. And what comes out is 10 paragraphs in 10 cultures include the word mushroom. Now, in contrast, we can look to some other psychotropic substances, wine, kava, beer, peyote, tobacco. And all of these, as you can see, are mentioned in many more cultures. And in each culture, they have many more mentions. So mushrooms are not only mentioned in a tiny fraction of human cultures in this huge database of mythology, but fewer paragraphs per every culture. And so despite their worldwide range, mushrooms appear to feature little in the world's mythologies. Now, again, I don't want to take this as evidence that mushrooms did not exist in the world's mythologies or were not used in various places. But I think it's, again, if anything, a call for more careful conclusions, to invite some kind of systematicity to these claims that might feel very attractive and very exciting. Okay, so that was a bit about these first two claims. Now I want to go into this third claim, that psychedelics have been used in shamanic contexts for therapeutic healing. Now again, we can go with this. There are many ways to think about psychedelics. I'm only going to focus right now on serotonergic psychedelics. So a claim that you sometimes see is this idea that modern therapeutic applications echo ancient use. An example is this quote from the UCLA psychiatrist Charles Grob. And he said in an interview published in Goop, I don't know if people are familiar with Goop, it's like a self-care brand. But he said, the shaman would administer these compounds only for circumscribed reasons, such as an initiation rite or a healing ceremony to address individuals with severe medical or psychological problems. Now, this is a very familiar model for Westerners. It's a kind of psychiatric psychotherapeutic model. A patient is psychologically distressed, and then the shaman administers. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to argue that indigenous psychedelic use has been much more diverse and is in many ways much more interesting, much more fascinating, has many more lessons. I'm going to conclude that the psychiatric therapeutic analogy is misleading, but there are nevertheless, I think, important and interesting things we can learn. Okay, so perhaps the most important usage that which has been written about the most is use by specialists, by shamans. And a conclusion that many anthropologists have made in surveying psychedelic use in these contexts is that patients, in fact, very infrequently consume these substances, much more often it's specialists who are consuming them as a part of their services. So they might use it for divination, to identify the source of an illness, to engage with spirits, especially as a part of healing, maybe fighting aggressive sorcerers, that's often part of healing, in some instances killing enemies. This is often also very much tied to training. There's a sense that to use psychedelics, you have to undergo special training, and that training not only will very often involve frequent psychoactive drug use, but also things like diets, abstinence. So I'm just going to go through some examples. So we can start with Mazatec mushroom ceremonies. So in many ways, Gordon Wasson's Life article in 1957 really established this image of what indigenous psychedelic use looks like, and kind of created a springboard for applications in Western contexts. And he established this image of this Mexican mushroom shaman, a person in particular, the person he was working with, Maria Sabina, as a psychedelic guide. So she administers it to him, and then she sings. But in fact, the earliest descriptions of Mazatec mushroom use only mention consumption by specialists. They never mention consumption by non-specialists, and it's in these earliest documented articles, it's always in the context of goals like curing, divination, finding lost objects. Non-shamans may have consumed psychedelics in ceremonies before 1950s, but if so, it was sufficiently auxiliary that it was not mentioned. An example of use by specialists that has been documented and studied in great depth is that by the Yanomama. They arguably consume several psychotropic or psychedelic substances, but I think the most important seems to be Varrola snuff. So this is 5-MeO-DMT is the active ingredient there. Shamans would consume it either alone or in groups. There's an incredible ethnographic film. It's called Magical Death. The beginning of the film shows this shaman Dedehewa taking a Varrola snuff and healing just by himself. He's attacking spirits, but later in the film, it shows a group of shamans together taking Varrola snuff, and they are directing spirits to attack children in an enemy group. It's a bit disconcerting, potentially, but it's also, I think, an important image that many psychedelic enthusiasts should also, I think, embrace or understand this more complicated moral stance of these substances. And this relates to something that the ethnomusicologist Brabec de Mori has recently argued, which he says is that there is a bit of a whitewashing, what he calls a whitewashing of indigenous psychedelic use in the broader discourse, where shamans are often considered good. Ayahuasca use is by definition, he says, beneficial. Now, the Yanomama are not using ayahuasca, but Brabec de Mori himself worked with Shipibo peoples. He in fact married a Shipibo woman and lived with the Shipibo for many years, and came to really appreciate that ayahuasca in these contexts has a much more morally complicated use, where it's used both to address sorcery, but in some instances to also engage in sorcery. Now, I said that consumption by patients seems infrequent. Nevertheless, there is some consumption by patients. So this is rare in number. So an example is these mestizo communities in the Peruvian Amazon, Dobkin de Rios, and her Peruvian journalist colleague, Rumriel, documented shamans occasionally consuming ayahuasca with patients. But again, a really important thing is that in these contexts, ayahuasca is viewed as a means of accessing special powers and engaging with the supernatural, and very often, again, encircled or ensconced in this whole discourse of sorcery, of identifying witches causing illness. Now, there are many more aside from healing. There's communal consumption. In some contexts, groups of non-specialists, typically men, will consume. One of the most striking examples that I have come across is among the Pume. So the Pume are mostly hunter-gatherers, or they were mostly hunter-gatherers. It's a very materially, or materially insecure environment, so they really lived at the edge of subsistence. But Rusty Greaves, who has spent many, I don't know, many years, I think, with the Pume, has documented that on a third of nights, they will have 11-hour dances in which all men will consume yopo snuffs, which seem to be bufotenine, maybe some 5-MeO, maybe DMT, sometimes with kapi and yahe. There's also curing and communication with the dead during these dances. But the really striking thing here is that the Pume are really struggling to get sufficient food, and nevertheless spending every third night up the entire night dancing and taking yopo. And it's a bit puzzling, and I think also demonstrates how meaningful these kinds of experiences can be for some people. Just another example, the Barasana, this is a Tucano speaking group. So they would have these nighttime ceremonies in which many men would consume ayahuasca, 8 to 10 cups in a night. This would be overseen by shamans and elders. And this is suffused with mythological themes. So there's this book, I forget what the title is. I think the title is something like Flying to the Milky Way or something. But in these ceremonies, people are said to experience death. They go through the moment of creation. They meet deities. They have what we would consider very mystical experiences. So thinking about mystical experiences, now this is something that my colleague Sandeep Nayak and I have really run into quite a bit in the Orinoco, and is not actually talked about very much in the literature, but people will say that they use psychedelics for knowledge, for sabiduría. So with the Piroa, we found this institution of kind of apprenticeships where individuals will seek out long-term relationships with a shaman where they will regularly take yopo with kapi. These apprenticeships can go on for many years. Sometimes groups of apprentices would use them together. And we found a lot of mysticism wrapped around this. So people would talk about this as a time where they can encounter deities. We talked to one man, he was a school teacher, and he talked about before he started his apprenticeship, he never heard the rainforest, but now he can truly listen to it. He said he has discovered a distinction between his spiritual self and his moral self. So they not only lead to these kinds of powerful experiences, but there's also a discourse around those experiences and understanding what they are. Finally, recreational. So here's another quote from Charles Grab. He says, in the shamanic world, these compounds are never taken for frivolous reasons that would be absolutely taboo. It would be a heresy to misuse these compounds for hedonic reasons. I would say that every community that we have visited, people are very frank about occasional recreational use. So they would say, during a festival, we might take it. We might take it to make conversation easier. I've just gone through all of these other contexts, but I will also say that many of these have recreational elements. So the knowledge apprenticeships where apprentices are getting together, that, can be to have mystical experiences. It can also be to have a shared experience that is recreational, that is fun. And again, I think that there's much more value here in investigating these kinds of contexts rather than overlooking them or marginalizing them or misrepresenting them because of the kinds of stories we want to tell. So a thing ending with the diversity of use is the diversity of subjective effects. And this is from a paper that myself and some colleagues have coming out pretty soon. And so in this paper, we just looked at as many first and second person accounts of psychedelic experiences in non-Western settings that we could find. And what we found is that there are many experiences that people report in these non-Western settings that reveal kind of persistent subjective effects that are excluded by the scales that are settings. These are things like extrasensory perception, travel, encounters with kin and ancestors, feelings of purification and initiation, transfiguration, and violence. Just a takeaway that we have in this paper is that studying a greater array, a greater diversity of experiences can expose some of the limitations of using these existing instruments. Now, I would say, just to come back to this previous presentation on perennialism versus constructivism, I mean, one argument that you can make is that these are the kinds of experiences that you find much more often in non-Western settings. I think another is that these kinds of experiences are also common in clinical and recreational settings, but we have just not considered them to nearly the same degree. And I mean, from speaking to people, I think these are not uncommon. Okay. I next wanted to, so I've gone through a lot of the ways in which psychedelics are used and the ways in which they're missing from some shamanic contexts. But I also want to ask if there's anything that we can learn from the world's shamanic traditions in our considerations of healing and potentially using psychedelics. So I'm going to define shamans here as specialists who enter non-ordinary states to provide services like healing and divination, and that those non-ordinary states involve engagement with unseen realities. So shamanism seems to be ubiquitous. Shamanism, as I've defined here, so there's a paper by Peoples et al. In 2016. I think they found it in 26 out of 33 hunter-gatherer ethnographies, but they're missing it in a couple. I went back and looked at the ones where they said it wasn't. And even these four, so one of these groups, the Seriono, lost shamanism as a part of, it seems as the demographic collapse following the European arrival in South America. Other groups visit so-called witch doctors and neighboring groups. And then we also have Winckelmann's project. So he found 43 trans practitioners in 43 out of 47 societies in the pseudo-random sample of human cultural and geographic diversity. Shamans over here includes witch doctors, mediums, also channelers. I think many religious prophets actually qualify as shamans. Just a shout out, given that we're in Finland, there's this great scholar, this religious studies scholar or theology scholar, Martti Nissinen in Helsinki, and he has an incredible book showing the ways in which ecstatic prophecy was common throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. So Greece, Babylon and Assyria, and then the Israelis and the Hebrews. He is wary about calling them shamans. He prefers to call it ecstatic prophecy. I think they do qualify as shamans, but it's great scholarship either way. So there's little research, unfortunately. This is kind of a theme throughout the talk, evaluating the effects or mechanisms of healing practices in traditional contexts. But nevertheless, there are some indications, and I've cited some good ones over here, that shamans and these other traditional healers do provide therapeutic benefits. Okay, so I thought this was maybe an opportunity for us to just watch some videos for you to appreciate what this might look like. So this is if you recall from earlier, I mentioned Nisa. She was that Kungsan woman who had taken, I think, a root to develop the ability to trance. So she's Kungsan or Jutwansi. This is a video, and so the Kung would enter trance in these trance dances. They would go on for a long time. The sound is like people clapping, and the sounds of the shakers on the healer's legs, and they're singing, and this can go on for a very long time. So this doesn't involve psychotropic substances right now as they're entering trance, but is nevertheless an
steps onto the basic beat. The Kung believe that the songs are given by the great God, and that they have medicine, a mystical potency capable of curing, dangerous if too strong. Exists in the music and the dance fire.
So yeah, here's a man. He's entering. They call it, I think, Kia. It's also known as half-death. So it's believed to be an incredibly dangerous and risky state of being that you can die in it.
In the atmosphere of the dance, their medicine becomes hot.
And so now he's believed to have. Now he's healing people. So he's touching them. If you heard it, he's also yelping. So he's extracting or he's like removing illness. In this state, people in Kia might also run into the forest. They might run into the fire. It's believed that they can see lions and other dangers very far. So this was just one example. Oh, and then Kia, you can be totally, it's very hard for you to kind of manage yourself, so it requires a lot of people to take care of you.
Although their behavior is formalized and in general the same while they are in trance, the degree of trance...
And this will go on all night, this kind of trance dancing. And I think, I forget exactly how often it occurred. I think it's like 2 to 4 times a month. But again, the Kungsan or hunter-gatherers, it's a pretty materially insecure life, but they're spending a substantial amount of their time having these trance dances. And so this is an example where in trance, in Kia, you might run into the forest. Okay, so that was one example. The other example is a video that I had taken. So this is where I work in Mentawai. These are Sikere, they are the shamans. Again, so there aren't psychotropic substances here. It's dance. And again, very interestingly, it's dancing in circles. But the way that trance manifests is quite different. And so this is just showing that, like, as they are entering trance, other people are entering these kind of ecstatic states. This is Max, that's your guy. And this kind of dancing also goes on all night. So I think this is around 11 p.m. It started at around 10:30, and it'll go on. Later, other people will start to dance. And you can kind of, if you look at their faces, you can see that they're, at this point, this is how it's kind of manifesting. And you can see again, there's like a sense that a lot of people have to take care of him. This guy is kind of having an experience. Okay, that was just to give you a sense of what this might look like. And the way that this dance in particular is understood, this is called Lajot Simagre. This is like a very important part of the Sikere institution. And he's like moving around this plate. It has turmeric and some other plants. And it's believed that the dance and this magical mush are incredibly attractive to spirits. And so all of these good spirits are flooding the dance floor, which is also why other people are said to experience trance. Okay, so I wanted to go into some potential mechanisms, I think, from working through the literature and into how this might be therapeutic. So an obvious one, I think, is potentially the placebo effect. There's really interesting evidence showing that the more immersive the procedure, the stronger your placebo response. So the more vivid it is, the more tactile it is, the more invasive. Just a quick example. So they compared sugar pills versus topical treatments versus fake needles versus surgery, sham surgery in the treatment of osteoarthritic pain, and find that the more immersive the experience, Another, and I think this is visible in both of these videos, is that these shamanic ceremonies involve a lot of social support. These kinds of ceremonies are often social gatherings. I remember one of the first ones I went to in Mentawai, I was like, this feels much more like a party than it does a medical appointment. Everyone's feasting. The guy who's sick is having a great time. There's dancing. So after the Sikere do these kinds of dances, then other people go up and they do dances that are not necessarily understood to be for healing. They're more just, it's a time also of dancing. And as we saw with the trance dance, the Kung trance dance, these interventions are sometimes considered to be very dangerous, and they can thus be interpreted as signs of commitment and support. So I have a colleague or an anthropologist I know an anthropologist and have interviewed her for something I'm working on, where she herself suddenly started screaming in the night. She was having a lot of anxiety, and they went through and did this trance dance for her. And she talked about feeling not only incredibly calmed, but incredibly supported and incredibly loved. And she said the next morning she's driving in her Jeep, and a black mamba leaps through the window and slams into the car door. And she's normally a very anxious person, but was like, "You missed," and like opened the door. And she was just feeling, she was in a great mood, she said. And then the one that I've come to really think is very important is the ways in which these can revise their patients' narratives. And this is something we've seen a lot working in Colombia. It's that patients will come to these ceremonies with narratives or models of their suffering. So a big one that we see in Colombia is a patient would come and they'll say, I've been feeling down. I don't want to move. Like my body is sore. I don't want to socialize. I think I'm being hit by witchcraft. And so then they'll go to one of these shamans, and the shamans will take yopo, they'll take kapi. And as I've written here, to the extent that the shaman and the ritual are considered powerful, they then have the capacity to change these patients' narratives. The patient comes out and they feel like, okay, I've been cleansed, the witch has been dealt with. And regardless of what the etiology is, even that patient's understanding of like, now I can go out and not be bullied by witchcraft. Now I can trust people much more because I'm not being haunted by witches, I think leads to this kind of positive behavior. There's, I think, quite a bit of anecdotal evidence that we've seen. There's also a lot of work on things like common factors. But again, I think systematic research in these kinds of settings and in these kind of contexts is lacking. This is something that I think there's a lot of interesting and important space for. But this is a place where I thought there was an interesting and useful parallel with psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, where it seems that the healing comes from the power of the experience to change your story about yourself. Okay, so to sum up, I've argued and provided evidence that reliable evidence of hallucinogenic use of classic psychedelics is limited to a few cultures, particularly in the Americas. I think modern psychiatry is a misleading analogy and distracts from the diversity of use. There have been many uses from knowledge cultivation to recreational use, but I think the most important may have been for specialists to access these powers and engage with these unseen realities to heal, divine, battle enemies and witches. And it seems that shamanism may heal through some common mechanisms as psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, to tie it in. The really important thing, I think, is that more systematic research is needed, both cross-cultural and fieldwork. I see that I have a bit of time, so I'm just going to go through this final slide. So this is me and how you can find me online. The fieldwork component of this is done with my colleague Sandeep Nayak, and he's also actually been very important in the review. Most of what I've just presented will be a part of my upcoming book, Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. This covers 2 of the chapters. It should be out in early 2025. Given that we have a little bit of time, I'll just come to this example really quick. So I put forward that quote in the beginning from Neolife that said, psychedelics have been used for millennia by indigenous peoples around the world, from the Amazon basin to Gabon to the American Great Plains. Now, there are 2 examples that are really being highlighted in this quote, the Amazon basin, or that I'm highlighting, the Amazon basin and the American Great Plains. So ayahuasca. Okay. What people like Brabec de Mori and Peter Gao have argued is that ayahuasca is probably has diffused through, a really important word here should be the Peruvian Amazon. I don't want to make a claim about the Amazon more broadly, and both of them are, I think, much more careful. But the evidence suggests that ayahuasca has at least diffused through the Peruvian Amazon in the last 300 years. So the Shipibo, who are often regarded as, I was at another conference or workshop recently and they called them the Harvard of ayahuasca, but the Shipibo themselves say that it came from the Kukama, it's not indigenous, it came from this other group. These were a people missionized and settled early. Other peoples remember adopting it in the last 50 or even 25 years. So Brabec de Mori, who again has spent a lot of time with the Shipibo, in part because he is married to a Shipibo woman or was married to a Shipibo woman, has tracked the historical diffusion of ayahuasca with post-colonial encounters with the movements of missionaries and the rubber industry. There's linguistic evidence. So what he at least argues is that in the Peruvian Amazon, words for ayahuasca and related activities are very similar despite a lot of linguistic diversity. And then he is an ethnomusicologist, and what he himself has argued, or what he thinks as a very important source of evidence over here, is that the musical diversity, the diversity of music in the Peruvian Amazon is incredible, except for ayahuasca songs, he argues, which not only which are pretty like melodically stereotyped, but are frequently not even sung in Amazonian languages. So another thing, just again thinking about these presumably deep examples, is peyote. And so this comes from a recent book by Mike J. I think someone else had referenced Mike J. earlier today. So peyote does appear to be ancient. There are these dried buttons that are next to rock art from 3700 BC. But the ancient evidence seems restricted to the Rio Grande area and southwards, to the native range. And there is no evidence of it being in the American Great Plains until the 18th and 19th century, when peyote seemed to be transported with trains and the reservation system. So just the conclusion I wanted to quickly make, given that I had some time here, is that many popular narratives about ancient use are either more complicated or potentially just wrong in some instances. And these narratives can perpetuate images of indigenous peoples who are otherwise also very marginalized as ahistorical rather than as flexible innovators and adopters. Okay, yeah, so I just, given that I had a little bit of time, wanted to go through that example, but otherwise, thanks a lot for your attention, and I'll gladly take any questions if there are any.
Yes, marvelous. Thank you. It was a really great talk. So now we have 15 minutes for questions and comments and thoughts on this great talk. So who wants to start? I'll bring the mics.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the great presentation. It was really insightful. And my question is that after this presentation, I feel like many of my beliefs about ancient use of psychedelics has been wrong. And I might be not the only one here. So I'm just wondering, like, why is there this other narrative of, like, there has been psychedelic use, like, for millennia, and it has been really, like, wide among the indigenous people. So do you have any idea where has this another maybe false view come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So one response that I've heard from other people, so Erica Dick, for example, who I think she gave a talk yesterday, this was something that I had heard from her. What she suspects is that these kinds of narratives that psychedelics have been used everywhere for a very long time and are a deep part of like human healing traditions, are a way of removing some of the stigma and fear from psychedelics, that this is other complicated cultural history for the last 50, 60, 70 years, and a way to maybe alleviate that distance and alleviate that apprehension and fear is to say, no, this is something that is deeply a part of our history. And so maybe it's actually for political or monetary incentives. I mean, the ayahuasca story, not to pick on ayahuasca, it's, but there are retreats in the Peruvian Amazon who will also very often claim that this is many millennia old. And so I think not only does it maybe help sell psychedelics more generally, but it also helps sell particular experiences.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'd like to comment just briefly on this. Like you said, that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. I think like the example of about these visionary cultures is that when I first got into this psychedelic use, I kind of like understood that where all these religious visionary experiences could stem from. So even though we don't have the evidence that they did use psychedelics, although, for example, in Veda books, there is the mention of the soma, and there is kind of like hints there and there about such things. But I think like the visionary experiences and the evidence of these like visionary experiences, like for example in the prophetic books you mentioned, hint towards that there might be something like that, even though we don't know. So that's perhaps something we can take into account when we think that might there be something like universal, maybe psychedelic use, even though we don't have direct evidence about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. I do think it raises the question of, can you have visionary experiences without psychedelics, or can you have meaningful epiphanies, spiritual epiphanies without psychedelics? And I think the evidence suggests that you can, but I agree that there is a larger question there. I mean, I see an analogy in there is this tradition in archaeology of how to interpret cave art. And there's a whole trend there that cave art is ecstatic art produced by shamans, the human-animal hybrids, the swirls, etc. But I think those kinds of hypotheses can sometimes constrain our sense of possibility. I mean, I think it's just as plausible that people have sufficient creativity to produce an animal human hybrid, or that a swirl is an appealing aesthetic object regardless of whether you're having an ecstatic state or not. And I think maybe something analogous is potentially happening with visionary states.
Continuing with the same theme, of course, you mentioned Wasson's Life article and the big impact it had. And then, of course, Wasson and Hoffman and Carl Ruck went on to write The Road to Ulysses, which, of course, then tells us that way in the middle of the Greco-Roman culture, our culture, European culture, there is a use of mystical substance or some sort of hallucinogenic. And then the problem with that was that nobody cared about that hypothesis really that much. There's another article from, I think it was 2010, Carl Ruck writes, he says, slightly sort of bitter tone, he says that we did one interview after that. So I would like your reaction to that sort of thing. Maybe we have this sort of self-correcting instinct, perhaps, in dismissing those types of stories of ancient use. And in this case, it just kind of manifested itself as Ruck said, nobody really cared about our hypothesis about ancient uses of psychedelics in Europe.
Wait, so you're saying perhaps conceptualizing this as a correction, it can be conceptualized as paying more attention to the set of hypotheses about ancient use?
You lost me there. But
Can you repeat your question?
I wanted your reaction to the Road to Ulysses theory and the fact that it was dismissed and kind of forgotten, because we just talked a lot about how we are very much drawn into this idea of ancient uses of psychedelics.
Yeah, okay. Great question, good point. And actually, whenever I give this talk, I'm asked about, or very frequently, I'm asked about the mysteries, and need to do more work on my own part to have a better answer. My exposure to that hypothesis is mostly, honestly, through the immortality key, which, from the parts of that book that I can evaluate, felt like many conjectural claims that, for each of which there's a bit of uncertainty, but except stacked on top of each other. And at least the cases for which I knew, the alternative evidence was not provided. So the example is soma. And the interpretive lens over there was very much like soma is a psychedelic. But Sandeep has worked much more trying to understand soma than I have, and has concluded that the evidence is much more suggestive of it being pressable plant, Central Asia, Iran, ephedra. And I only mention that as an instance where I see that book and that the larger claim of the mysteries are an LSD kind of substance as just a stack of many conjectures where he is taking a certain interpretive lens. And so I think it's an open hypothesis. I think there's more uncertainty than maybe he admits in that particular book. But more generally, I certainly agree with the fact that interest in evaluating and coming back to these kinds of hypotheses varies with time. And right now, as the last talk made, or as one of the last talks made clear, this is a time of, there's a psychedelic renaissance, which I think both creates interest in pushing these kinds of stories, but then on my end of kind of like correcting them or bringing some empiricism. I think this is a moment in which there's interest in the stories from whichever angle renewed. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thanks. And the next one.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I also appreciated your claim on the limited use of psychedelics, historically limited. But I was wondering about the term psychedelics. It's a recent term, starting from the 1950s. What about sacred plants or psychoactive, psychotropic kind of plants which do not necessarily qualify as psychedelics? What about kind of their historical use? For instance, hashish has been used in South Asia, in Islam, since the 11th century. So there is much more to it. So if we talk about psychedelics and limit their use to 5% in South America, we miss out kind of the use of sacred plants in other contexts and basically with similar effects. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I was talking to someone at dinner yesterday who had brought up, like, does the word psychedelic, is that even appropriate over here if the model of psychedelic is mind manifesting? And maybe the conceptual model or the dominant model here is not one that involves the mind, but maybe something of supernatural contact or something else. And I thought that was a very good point, and that's not something that I address here, but I think deserves its own kind of discourse. Towards your question more generally of the frequency of psychotropic substances, that is a bit why I presented Winckelmann's 1992 paper, where he finds, at least for trance practitioners, so practitioners who are entering trance, he finds this like 22 out of 45, which is, of course, much bigger than 1% that Martin Fortier finds. So I think, yeah, psychotropic substances are common. I would say, I provided the example of Mentawai where I work, and this kind of topic became very salient to me because people would often assume that the Mentawai are using psychotropic substances to enter trance or during these all-night dances, and they're not. And so I think both as it is common, people have also devised many ways of engaging these non-ordinary states.
Thank you for a really interesting presentation. One thought that came to my mind is if it's framed as accessing altered states of consciousness in context of providing healing or other services. My wonder is it more widespread as a kind of overall practice than only using psychedelic substances? For example, you can access altered states of consciousness through drumming, dancing, sex, pain, and also psychoactives, sensory deprivation. There are like multiple pathways to these states. And I feel like maybe the overall accessibility of shamanistic practices is much more widespread than actually utilizing only one specific way to access it. For example, psychoactive substances. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. So I presented that slide where other surveys have found that specialists who enter non-ordinary states to engage with unseen realities and provide services like healing and divination are found in almost all documented hunter-gatherer societies, in 43 of 47 societies, according to another survey. I mean, the thesis of my book is that shamanism is a hyper-compelling means of dealing with uncertainty that humans reliably reconstruct everywhere, and that we are, yeah. So I completely agree.
Thank you for the fascinating talk. I appreciate you tackling the prevailing narrative that psychedelic use has been this worldwide millennial tradition. But I'd be interested to hear more about the indigenous narratives of their origins for these plants that they use. For instance, you showed the evidence for ayahuasca and peyote there at the end, but I'd love to hear, what do the people who've actually been using these substances, what do they think? Where do these traditions originate from? Where do these plants come from? And what is their power based on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's incredibly variable. I wouldn't want to put forward one narrative that I think applies across the board. So something that Brabec de Mori has written about, at least in relation to the Shipibo, is he says there's a double discourse. There's the discourse that is provided to tourists, and he says anthropologists are overwhelmingly counted as tourists, and then the discourse amongst themselves. And the discourse to tourists is like ayahuasca is a part of Shipibo culture and has been a millennial old tradition. The discourse amongst themselves, at least according to Brabec de Mori, is that it comes from the kukama. The kukama are much more powerful. If you want to properly if you want to either be trained as an ayahuasquero or you want to have the most effective healing, it comes from going to the kukama. But again, I would say it's incredibly variable. I think I would also say that I think regardless of the narrative of its use, I think many people also put a lot of meaning and significance and importance on it.
All right, thank you. I think it is time for us to have some psychoactive coffee now. So thanks again, Dr. Singh, and